delighted to be here and to commiserate with the Manchester students on the withdrawal of a course that they like very much. Congratulate Dave on an article about it and getting publicity for it. Pluralism is a word which a lot of us have used for a long time, but which may, I think, become slightly in contention. So I want to talk about it in a very general way. I'm sure you all know an old Sufi story about three blind men who were charged with describing an elephant. And one of them grabbed a hold of the tail and he said, well, this elephant thing is like a rope or maybe a liana. And another one grasped the leg and said, it's like a pillar. And the third one, who seemed for some reason to be up a ladder, grabbed hold of its ear and said, oh, it's a flying carpet, this elephant is a magical beast. And they met each other, and you can imagine the bickering which followed, each one putting forward his own idea of what this elephant was like, and none of them able to agree. Now, that's the clash of paradigms that Diane referred to, and gets us not very far at all. But there are other ways of treating differences of perception like that. They could simply agree to differ and go off and have a cup of tea. And each one could tell the other what the elephant was like according to his own lights. That is more or less how economics was taught when I came into it, much earlier than Diane. Everyone had his own perspective. Syllabuses were not prescriptive. Lecturers could teach, they were given an area in which to teach, but they could teach according to their own lights. And so you could go from a Marxist lecturer to a Keynesian lecturer to a neoclassical lecturer, and so on. It was up to you to sort it out. And that's more or less like talking to all the three blind men in turn and trying to make your sense of what this elephant might be. There is another way, which is for the three blind men to say, well, now, why do I have such a completely different idea of what this beast is than you have? Where were you standing when you touched this elephant? Take me to where you were. And each tries then to get some idea of the perspective from which the other is arguing. And then they begin to see that there is a whole, this elephant thing, of which they have only very partial knowledge. They become aware in trading their perspectives one with the other and sharing their perspectives as best they can, that this thing is bigger than they thought, and that their knowledge of it is much more limited than they could possibly have understood at the time. Now, the kind of pluralism which was around when I was taught economics, the live and let live, teach what you like, within reason, was permissive and live and let live, but didn't actually progress understanding across the barriers that existed, which themselves were formed by the very partial quality of the understanding that each participant had. I know a couple of books comparing Marx and Keynes, for example, Now, it's a difficult thing to pull off because it takes a lifetime to understand Marx and it takes a lifetime to understand Keynes, and we each have only one life. So all these books are biased toward the one that the author knows best in a very palpable way. They aren't even-handed, they aren't really successful. So it's a difficult thing to do, to get to the bottom of why it is we might differ sometimes. I mean, with complex things like Marx and Keynes, it's difficult. But it isn't always difficult. Some things are really very simple. If you said, well, let's pick a problem and ask some economists what they think about it. Let's ask them what to do about unemployment, for example. And you go to a new classical economist, and he will tell you, oh, well, the economy is always in equilibrium, and equilibrium means market clearing, and market clearing means there is no unemployment, except, of course, voluntary unemployment. So you think, well, that's not a hell of a lot of use. I'll go and ask somebody else. And you go to a neoclassical economist of a certain kind, and they'll say, well, it's clearly a labour market problem. And if there's unemployment, it means that the price which you're trying to sell your labour is too high, so you lower the wage, and that will solve the problem. And you go to a Keynesian of almost any stripe, and they will say, well, if you try that, you might make the matters worse, because wages are income as well as a cost. And you may be trying to get your costs down, but you mustn't forget that demand comes from income. And furthermore, the wage earner is likely to earn less than most other people in the economy, and their marginal propensity to consume will be higher, and therefore income will go down, and the demand for your product will go down, and this isn't going to help unemployment at all. Now, what is the difference between these three people's answers? One is dedicated to equilibrium and thinks it always applies. The next one has a method of looking at markets one at a time. And the third looks at a system taken as a whole and incorporates the feedback that's involved in that kind of perspective. It has a different answer. And the answer was you stimulate demand by lowering interest rates or talking up expectations or by government expenditure or something like that. So they had different policy prescriptions and different theories, and their theories came actually from different methods that underlay the theories that they were putting forward. Now, when you begin to understand something like that in a simple problem like that, you've actually made quite a lot of progress, because you can say why they disagreed when you ask them what to do about unemployment. And that's what you really want to know. What is the source of the difference between them? And this is much, much more interesting than live and let live pluralism. This is a much more creative way of looking at it. But if things get too difficult, like comparing Marx and Keynes, you might come unstuck. You have to recognize that not all problems are amenable to this kind of interplay. But Andy Dennis, who wrote a very interesting article in a book called Teaching Post-Keynesian Economics, edited by two Danish people, compares those two kinds of pluralism. And makes the point that our standard for a truly pluralist approach has moved way beyond live and let live, and has begun to demand for those of us who are interested in a pluralist approach, begun to demand a much more creative interplay between people of different views. Let's go back to our three blind men. and recognized for a start they were all, each in their own way, right. They said completely different things. They were all right, but the reason they disagreed was because of their limitations. Now, the economy is a complex entity, like an elephant. And so there is a great deal of terra incognita, you know. Difference in perspective can completely change the way theories are looked at. And so let's suppose that the blind men went off and said, well, actually, I think we recognize this thing is bigger than any of us, and we better get some help. And they made some friends and expanded their knowledge quite substantially. But while they were doing that, another person came along and said, look, you chaps are going about things entirely in the wrong way. You exemplify the known problem with induction, that to generalize from a small sample is a very dangerous thing to do and is likely to lead you astray. I will build you a scientific model elephant. And this elephant will be superior to any elephant understood by inductive reason, simply because it will be constructed on rational scientific principles. Now, for some reason which I don't quite understand, this chap with his scientific model elephant managed to capture the castle and kick the blind men and their friends out and determine who should be citizens of the castle and who was unacceptable. And this is to a large extent the situation which heterodox economists face today. But the same principles apply to the interplay between this person with his scientific model elephant and as that between the three blind men themselves. There is something to be learned on both sides from paying attention to how this model elephant was constructed. I was dismayed to read in the draft report from post-crash economics of the teaching at Manchester, a sentence that went something like this: we were frequently told that what we were seeking was not available from economics, that we should be looking at psychology, anthropology, history, philosophy for the things that we were searching for. So economics was being defined in this very narrow way as coterminous with the approach of the man with the model elephant. And the blind men are knocking at the gate saying, hey, we're economists too, we're also interested in elephants. And we encourage you, if you wouldn't mind, to compare your rational model elephant with our conception of an elephant, which is now much more fleshed out than it was at the very beginning, and see how the two compare. That is the present state of play, it seems to me, in the dialogue between post-crash economics and Manchester's economics department. And I hope that Diane will do something to bridge the gap between those two positions. It sounds as if she might. So I think just to finish off, the important thing really is to explore in your own minds how far pluralism can take you We don't want a clash of paradigms. That's just a waste of time. That's the three blind men bickering, the very first stage of their intellectual development. We want to move on to another stage of economic development where the three blind men realize that what they understand by an elephant is context-specific. I happen to be standing next to the leg, and therefore I think it's a pillar, but my friend over here thinks it's a rope because he's got the thing by the tail. That's an important lesson, and economics is full of lessons of that kind. I just gave you a simple example and a complex example. So it's, I think, an area, pluralism is an area where there's a great deal to discuss about what it is and how to pursue it. And the last thing in the world we want to do is to bicker and be divisive. What you really want to do is say, why do you think that? What's really at the bottom of this idea? And do we think in different ways? And if so, why is that? I leave you to it.